All right, good morning. Welcome to Wednesday in week 13, the last week of class. Just a couple of classes to go. Almost ready to cross the finish line. How does it feel? Sad? Why?
Because I'm old now.
Because you're older now by 13 weeks.
Because I'm finishing high school.
Uh-huh.
Feels like I'm old.
So this is your last term as a high school student? Okay, and then what? Well, then you're old, yeah, but what are you going to do as an old person? You going to go right to retirement?
You know, it just feels bad. I feel like it's kind of out.
Sure. Yeah, it's the end of something, right? Yeah. It's how can we it's weird, and actually if we want to turn this into a comparative cultures moment, it's interesting because culturally when you look at, when something changes, right? When there's something you're doing or something that you are, and you're kind of becoming something different, usually we have some sort of ritual to mark that, right? And it's true of every culture, right? Whether it's, when people get married, for instance, it's a big deal, right? That's a big life change. You're committing to someone, you're becoming sort of a different person in society, and so there's usually some kind of ritual, right? There's some kind of marriage ceremony that marks that change from one state to the other. And so, in school, we should have that as well, right? And I'm sorry to say, like, if this was a normal school, sorry, quote unquote, it is a normal school in some ways, but also not, we would have that, right? Like we would have prom or grad or whatever you want to call it, right? You would go up and get your little diploma with your, flat hat and gown, and even though it's kind of silly, it is a ritual that marks kind of an end of something and a beginning of something else. But here, because you're all kind of finishing your own programs, and some people will be done this term, some people will be done next term or the term after. Everyone kind of finishes at a different point, and it kind of feels weird, right? Like it feels like it's like there's no closure, right? Like there's no clear end point that's been marked. And so yeah, I think for that point for that reason it's kind of a little strange. And COVID, of course, has made it much worse because now we can't really get together in groups, and so the whole thing is kind of bizarre, right? And you're old now. Yeah, I know. I've got bad news for you on that front. You will continue to get old, and the 13 weeks won't seem like very much later on, but yeah, bad news. They also tell me that as you get older, time goes faster, which I think is not encouraging because it seems to go pretty fast already, so I don't really want it to go, in another 20 years, I don't want time moving faster still. I'm good with where it is. I don't know. Is there anything more we should say about that? About oldness and how we feel at the end of class? No? Everyone just is ready for a break? Who's coming back next term? Nicholas? Adel, are you done? You're coming back? You're coming back, but as a UT? Yeah, that's cool. Sophie, are you coming back next term?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not? Okay. Amanpreet, are you back next term?
As a UT.
As a UT? Okay. Cool. Yeah, I don't know what to expect for Well, I think next term will be very similar to this one, but for fall, I don't know what to expect. I know the ministry wants us to be, everybody to be fully back in classes, but they don't seem to be doing a very good job of vaccinating people very quickly, so it's anybody's guess.
But I had the vaccine is also for no use now. If you get 2 vaccines, but still a person who got the 2 is still getting COVID.
Right, that's possible. And to be honest, I don't know where that leaves us. Because if we're all vaccinated, so if you imagine the college is full and it's full of vaccinated people, but people can still get sick, I think it'll be a question of, I don't know that anyone knows what that will be like. And as a society, I don't know what it looks like when everyone's vaccinated, but we still have COVID. So what do we do? Do we just try to keep washing our hands and hope we don't get sick? Or hello, I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. And to be honest, I don't know that anyone else knows either. I think that, that everyone's working hard to, well, I hope everyone's working hard to get vaccines rolled out and to get people vaccinated, but yeah, after that, I don't know what happens. I don't know what happens. And, it might be something more like the flu, right? Where we have flu vaccines, but people still get the flu every year, right? And so it may be like that with COVID, is that everyone might be vaccinated, but some people still might get sick. I really don't know. I think all we can do is kind of keep our fingers crossed, get vaccinated as soon as we can, and then just see what the future looks like, because I don't know. Does anyone know? Nicholas, do you know what will happen in the future? You're not going to tell? I'll try and look surprised. Promise. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. I think, so far the government is telling us that they would like everyone to be back in class full time in fall, but I don't know if that will come to pass. I don't know if that's realistic. I don't know where we'll be in 5 more months. I have no answers for you. I'm sorry to say. But I guess we're all in the same boat, right? I think. Okay. Let's start. So Irene is here. Good morning, Irene. We're going to jump into where we were yesterday talking about BC First Nations. So I actually have a film for you to watch, and so I'm kind of trying to set up enough background knowledge so that parts of the film make sense. It's a very kind of local story, and actually the film itself kind of overlaps 2 things. And so if you're in social justice, you'll kind of get something out of the film too, and if you're in this class, you'll see different things. And so it's an interesting film about Indigenous culture, but also Indigenous activism, social justice issues, but also art and culture, and it's kind of a bunch of things mixed together. So I think if you're in this class or if you're in both classes, you'll get different things from it. But anyway, we'll get to that in a little bit. So what were we talking about yesterday? Oh yeah. So we said that the first people to populate what is now British Columbia came about 10 to 15,000 years ago. During that time, these people were simple foragers, right? So they moved around a lot. They kind of hunted and fished and collected whatever food they could find. Again, living in very small groups, moving around a lot. But that changed over time, and it changed over time mostly because of this animal here, right? And so once BC First Nations, particularly on the coast here, once they started harvesting and storing salmon away, and doing that with other foods, that allowed them to stay in one place for longer. It allowed them to their populations to grow larger, and it allowed them to sort of stop moving around so much. And so First Nations people who traditionally lived on the coast here would kind of live in a large village during the winter months, and then as it became spring and summer, they would kind of spread out to different places. They would move around a little more, but then in the fall or winter, they would come back to their larger village and live there. And they were able to do this because they were storing food away, which is something that simple foragers tend not to do. They tend not to store any food, but people in this part of the world did, right? And so lots of salmon in the fall would come up the rivers, and indigenous people would, this is not an indigenous person, this is a very white person, sorry Dad, but they would harvest these salmon, process them, dry them out, keep them for winter. So it was really the salmon that allowed indigenous people in this part of the world to kind of move from a simple foraging strategy to a more complex one. And so the salmon is really what allows people to live in bigger groups. It allows them to stay in one place longer, and it allowed kind of more social and cultural complexity because you had more people living together in a single group. Right, so all of that. We mentioned yesterday that in terms of trying to figure out the numbers of people who were here before Europeans, it's quite difficult. We don't really have a clear way of being able to estimate or being able to know for sure how many indigenous people lived in British Columbia before the Europeans arrived. Most people think somewhere around 200,000 or 300,000, which is a lot of people, but of course not nearly the number that live here today. And so again, in the Lower Mainland, we have about 2.4 million, I think. In British Columbia, there are 8 million people. Can somebody look that up for me? Population of BC. Nicholas is quick. I'm going to say 8 million. 9 million. 5 million? Shoot. What's that? As of 2019, there's only 5 million people in British Columbia. So still, that's quite a few. That's a large number more than the indigenous people that would have lived here before, right? But again, when you're foraging for a living, nature really only supports so many people, right? You can't have 5 million people living here and having them all hunt and gather, right? The environment won't support it. Right. So we said there's some broad kind of areas, some culture areas or ecological areas, if you will. There's people living in the Northwest Coast, and that's, living in that environment is a certain kind of experience. Living in the interior, in the plateau, is kind of a different type of experience, and Adels lived in the plateau, so you know it's kind of a different environment there. Living up in the north, in the subarctic, is another type of experience, right? It's going to get really quite cold in large portions of the year. And so one of the ways that you can see these environmental differences is in housing. And so I'm just skipping through these because we talked about them yesterday, but people along the coast here tend to build these really large cedar plank houses. And so we said that depending on where you go on the Northwest Coast, the house style differs a little bit. It's a little bit different in the north. It's a little bit different here. It's a little bit different further south into Washington and Oregon and California. But there are all these big houses that had multiple families living in them. Often a totem pole out front to sort of signify what clan or what family lives in the house. And I think they're pretty impressive. I think they're pretty amazing. If you go, and then toward the back of the house, you would often find this sort of, I'm not really sure what to call it, but I think I almost want to call it a stage, if you will, because this is the area where rituals would happen, where meetings would happen. There's a big drum in front of the totem poles, and so people would drum out a rhythm while dances were happening. And so this was kind of the celebration area, the main focus point for ritual and for community gathering. And so stage is not the right word, but it kind of functioned that way, if you will. I guess you could also say altar too, but it's not really an altar, but it's kind of a focal point for that activity. Yeah, so pretty substantial and pretty amazing winter villages here. Here's some further south in, I think, Oregon or California, I forget. And then people would create these sort of more simple houses in the summer. And again, often using the wood planks from their larger houses to build these smaller ones that they would live in for, a few months of the year. If you went into the interior, into the plateau, you would find, and sorry, I know I'm going through these really quickly, but we talked about them yesterday. You would find houses that were like this, pit houses. And so these are kind of partially below the ground, partially above. And so you would dig kind of a big circular hole in the ground, and then you would build a wooden structure over top of it, and then cover it with branches and mud and things like that to sort of seal it in, right? So you would have a few families living in these pit houses. Again, they're quite warm in the winter, right, because they're partially below ground. You can keep a fire going, during the colder months. And again, this is how people would live kind of in the interior. Right. We were going to talk about a little bit about diet yesterday. And so one of the things that made First Nations people in this part of the world successful was the fact that there's so much food here. So we said that salmon, of course, was an important resource for people, especially in the fall. But there's also all kinds of other fish to be caught as well. So there's these ulakens that I'll talk about in a minute. There's sturgeons and herrings and trout and cod. All of these fish were caught and eaten by indigenous people in the past and in the present. Some Northwest Coast people went out to sea and hunted sea mammals. And so I'll show you some canoes in a few minutes. But people would actually go out and hunt for seals, hunt for porpoises. Some people on the other side of Vancouver Island were actually whale hunters. And so they figured out ways to create harpoons and floats, and they would actually go out hunting full-on whales, which is unbelievably dangerous and very difficult to do. But again, if you manage to bring home a whale, you can imagine how much meat and fat and oil and bones for tools that provided. And so even though these people weren't hunting a lot of whales, when they did successfully take a whale, it was a huge bonus for the community, right? Because there was so much meat and fat that could come from it. But again, people were hunting whales. They were collecting invertebrates like mussels and cockles and crabs and clams and lobsters and all kinds of things. They were hunting all kinds of different land mammals like deer and elk and moose and rabbits and all kinds of things. There's lots of birds in the area as well. I know nowadays mostly what we see are seagulls and crows, but there's lots of other ducks and geese, although there's geese around, forest birds like grouse, really all kinds of different food resources in this part of the world. Lots of different animals, lots of different shellfish, lots of marine life, lots of fish themselves. Here's kind of a artist's rendition of a woman, an indigenous woman digging clams, right? So she's got her boat there, she's got a little woven basket, and she's digging away in a clam bed, right? And so people would eat clams as they continue to do today. There's also a ton of edible plants in this part of the world, and this is something that I don't know too much about. The animals are a little more intuitive to figure out. I don't know much about plants. But as an indigenous person, you would know a lot about plants, and you would know basically every plant that grew around here, and whether it was edible or whether it was poisonous, whether it had a medicinal use. Indigenous people knew every plant that grew here, and they knew what they could and couldn't do with it. Good morning. There's a lot of text here. But just have a look at this first line. So, recent research indicates that among coastal groups alone, wild plants used for food include about 50 species. So, people were able to find up to 50 species of edible plants in this part of the world, which is impressive, right? That's far more than I would have thought. But again, lots of berries, lots of roots, tubers, parts of trees and leaves, and all of these things are edible. And again, the indigenous people would have known how to collect them and how to process and eat them so that they were hopefully tasty. I don't know. Some people on the northwest coast here were harvesting algae as food, and so they knew how to collect certain types of algae and how to sort of prepare it and use it. Right. And technology. So this part of the world had a lot of technology that people used as well, and part of that had to do with the fact that, again, they were staying put in one place for a longer period. And so when you do that, you can have stuff, right? You can develop technology and use it. And so indigenous people in this part of the world developed all kinds of different hunting and fishing implements. And so, arrows, spears, snares, traps, fish weirs, which I'll show you a picture of in a second, harpoons to hunt seals and whales, all kinds of different things. So here you can see, I'm not sure how clearly you can see that, but you can see all kinds of different harpoons and arrow points. And so depending on what you were going hunting for, if it's a small animal or a big one, or maybe it's a marine animal, or maybe it's a fish, depending on what you were going hunting for, you would use a different arrow tip or a different spear tip. And so these are all kinds of different arrow or spear or harpoon heads that come from this part of the world. And so indigenous people had kind of a wide variety of tools that they would use depending on what they were hunting or fishing for, right? Here you can see a few pieces of technology that people would have used. Here you can see a fish weir, and so indigenous people would build this sort of fence across a river, if you will, and the fish can kind of get through, but it's more difficult for them to get through, and so they kind of bunch up when they get to the weir, when they get to that fence. And so you can see that indigenous people would have constructed a little platform to stand on with a little basket, and then, that saying, like shooting fish in a barrel, is basically what they're doing, right? The fish are all kind of, clogging up the weir, and you just stick with your harpoon and get as many fish as you can manage, right? And again, all of these fish would have been dried and stored away and used for the winter, right? You can see you can see a fish spear that they have here as well, which is pretty ingenious, because again, once you put the spear into the fish, how do you lift it up without the fish sliding off, right? But you can see it's got kind of teeth, right? So once you stick it into the fish, those other ones grab the fish, and you can pull it out of the water without losing it, right? And here you can see, this is kind of an artist's rendition, of course, but people hunting whales, right? So they've created harpoons with detachable harpoon heads. They've woven rope. You can see all the rope they've created. They have floats, and so usually what you do is you stick the harpoon into the whale, and then it's attached to a rope with a float. And so if you can attach enough of these things, it'll be difficult for the whale to submerge, right? And once it's difficult for the whale to submerge itself, then you can kind of stab it until it dies. Sounds brutal, I know, but of course, whales don't like to be stuck with things, and so it's pretty dangerous to go out there in a little canoe and start sticking pointy things into the side of a whale, right? But again, people knew how to do it. Incidentally, the floats were stomachs of like of elk and moose and things like that, and they would inflate the stomach and find a way to dry it out, so it was like a big hard balloon, if you will. And those are the things they used to hunt whales. Ingenious stuff. Yeah, here's a indigenous person here using one of those fish spears that I told you about. This is a fish weir, and I'm actually just gonna. No, it's okay. Don't worry. That's a fish weir, like I showed you before. Here's some salmon drying racks, and so these are a little more modern, as you can probably tell. But indigenous people in the past would have constructed something very similar to dry out all of that salmon, right? You can tell it's nice, fresh, wild salmon because of the color. The farm salmon tends to be kind of a light pinky color, but this is good, nutritious salmon. You also had indigenous people netting fish as well, and so the fish that they're netting here are called eulachon or candlefish, and people would net these fish because they're so oily. Apparently they're so oily that if you dry it out, if you dry the fish, you can actually light it on fire because it's still so oily. But indigenous people would net all of these fish, boil them up, and then save the oil for winter, and in some cases trade the oil with other groups as well. So yeah, so you can see here all of these small little eulachons being dried out for later use, right? Lots and lots of them. Other technology, some technologies were quite simple, although deceptively so. Indigenous people were very good at weaving baskets, and so they would collect plant material and shellfish and things in baskets. They would weave baskets like this, and they would be able to weave them to the point where they were actually waterproof. So you can actually fill this with water, and it will hold the water, which again is the skill to be able to do that is pretty amazing. So lots of baskets like this, woven with grasses and reeds and things. You would also see indigenous people when they were harvesting their food, they would also kind of help nature along. And so there is evidence, or there are stories about indigenous people, say, if there was an area that didn't have a lot of clams in it, they might actually take clams from one place and kind of stick them in another clam bed, and so that clam bed would kind of develop on its own. Or if there was a river that didn't have many fish in it, indigenous people would transfer some fish into the river to hopefully populate it. And so again, they weren't really growing their own food, it wasn't agriculture, but sometimes they did, help nature along, whether they had to transplant some animals from one place to another, or burn down a section of forest to encourage more growth. Indigenous people would kind of modify their environments a little bit and help it along, right, in order to gain more food. The other thing that is probably worth mentioning is that indigenous people would have harvested sustainably, right? So they would always leave more for later, right? So if you have a clam bed, it doesn't make sense to collect all the clams from that bed, because then there's no more clams and you're done, right? So people would kind of take a little bit from each area and then allow it to regenerate and regrow, right? And so you can see here that they would have taken some bark and some planks from living trees, but allow those trees to do it in such a way that the tree would survive and continue to grow, And so they also did some weeding, some pruning, again, just kind of managing their environment, right? Not growing their own food, not, you know, not doing anything drastic, but just kind of helping nature along, if you will. Yeah, so salmon eggs were transplanted from one creek to another. Sometimes they set controlled fires in order to burn down certain old sections of forest and get some fresh growth in there. So people were managing their environment, right? Hundreds or thousands of years ago. And again, they kind of knew what they were doing, right? They knew how to do these things. These people were cooking their food. Sometimes by boiling it, sometimes by cooking it in earth ovens. Earth ovens are really cool. Basically what you do is you take a bunch of food and you bury it under the ground, not very deep, just a little bit. You bury the food and then you build a huge fire on top of it, and you let the fire burn for, I don't know, 7 or 8 hours, and then you dig all your food out of the ground, and it's all it's all really soft and sort of cooked to perfection. It's almost like roasting vegetables or roasting a turkey or something like that. Really, really interesting. Let's see, what else do I have to tell you here? Lots of use of cedar. So the salmon are important to indigenous people here, but so is the cedar tree. And cedar trees get used for hats, for weaving clothing, for canoes, for parts of tools like spears and things like that, for houses, all kinds of things. So if the salmon is the number one resource for indigenous people, cedar is probably number 2. It's a very important resource for people in this part of the world. So yeah, there's the cedar tree, which you've probably seen around Vancouver. You'll know it's a cedar tree because it will smell really nice. The cedars have kind of a nice. Have you smelled them? They have a really nice smell, and I don't know how to describe it. It's a cedar smell, but if you see a cedar tree and nobody's looking because you don't want to appear weird, but go up to it and smell it. Okay, again, make sure nobody's looking, but yeah, go up and smell the tree, and you'll smell this very kind of earthy, sweet, woody kind of smell. I don't know how to describe it otherwise. But yeah, super important resource for indigenous people. This is a hat that is woven from cedar bark. And so they pulled little strings of bark off the cedar, and they've woven it into this pretty impressive hat. There's lots of canoes that were made, again, from cedar, usually from one single log that's hollowed out. And they sort of get painted, and so here's a canoe or a boat that some Coast Salish people had been using. This is from 1890. We see them using canoes in sort of artwork here, and even more modern, in more modern contexts. And so this is a bunch of modern day people, of course, indigenous people, but they're kind of I guess it's a bit of a, how do I explain this? I guess they're kind of showing off their culture, if you will, right? So people don't go to work in these things, but they got dressed up for the occasion. They've got their sort of traditional cedar hats on, and they've got their paddles, and this is kind of a traditional cedar canoe, and people would have been making these for hundreds and hundreds of years before, and they're still made. People in this part of the world are also excellent at weaving textiles, at weaving blankets and cloth. And so sometimes they use plant material, sometimes animal. So you can see mountain goats And sometimes even dog hair would have been used to weave with. And they were able to weave things that looked like this. And so, I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty impressive. That's a pretty impressive craft to weave such a thing. And yeah, there's lots of examples of these types of textiles that were woven by indigenous people. If you go to the the Museum of Anthropology on UBC campus, you'll see lots of stuff like this, but you'll definitely see some woven textiles as well. And they're pretty amazing. How much do I want to say about this? Social organization. Okay. We said that the social organization of indigenous people in this part of the world was, they had hierarchies, right? So there were some people that had more status and power than others. That's usually not the case with foragers. Foragers tend to be more equal, but here we had some social hierarchies appearing. So with the leader of a house being a chief, that chief is kind of head of the clan or head of the family. That position was hereditary, so you would inherit that position from your father, and he inherited it from his father's father. And clans kind of controlled access to, I guess to some degree, access to resources. And so, a given clan would be responsible for where you could hunt, where you could fish, what songs you could sing, what costumes you could wear. All of that had to do with your clan membership, right? So everyone would have belonged to a particular family group or a particular clan. But again, there was no kind of single authority. So there's no king or emperor to be seen here. Every village is full of multiple clans, and these clan leaders have to get together and decide things and come to an agreement. There's no great leader of any type. Let's see, I'm going to skip that because I've got a lot of information. Oh, this is another kind of interesting thing about people from the northwest coast. They don't do this anymore. And they didn't do this in all parts of the northwest coast, so some parts did and some parts didn't. But indigenous people in some parts of the world, or some parts of the northwest coast, used to cradle board their infants. And so what they would do is, when babies are small, you have to swaddle them, right? You have to kind of wrap them up and keep them nice and secure. You can have them like flopping everywhere. And so we still do that. We kind of, wrap them up in cloth to keep them sort of collected. Indigenous people would often sort of wrap them and kind of attach them to a piece of wood, right? And again, it was just for easier transport, right? Indigenous people are moving around a lot in the past, and so the board just helps them to, carry and move their infants and give them a place to put them down, right? So nowadays we have strollers, right, that people push their kids around in. This is kind of the equivalent of a stroller for indigenous people. And again, strollers don't work in the woods, right? So you have to have something like this. But what would happen is that because the kid's head would be kind of resting on the board, it would kind of flatten out their skull a little bit on the back. And so, as you probably know, the bones in an infant's head are very soft and they're not fully fused together yet, so you have to be very careful with the heads of babies. But also, if you have them lying on a hard surface, that bone will kind of flatten out as it grows. And so what some indigenous people would do is not only do that, but they would actually bind the heads of their children. So they would put just a little bit of pressure with either some rope or some cloth or material on the front part of the head to encourage their head to kind of grow into a bit of a point, right? So you can see here, certainly in the photo, although the photo is probably a little bit exaggerated, or the painting is probably exaggerated, but in the photo here, we have this indigenous man who has kind of his head's almost like a bit of a cone shape. And again, that had to do with cradle boarding. That had to do with sort of modifying the shape of the skull when he was a baby. And so it doesn't do anything to the brain. Like if you know what you're doing, then the brain will just slowly grow into the shape of the skull. So nothing bad happens if you know what you're doing and you're very careful. Don't try this at home, people, please. So there's no difference, there's no problem with the brain, but it does create a very different shape to the skull. And this is a shape of the skull that some indigenous people traditionally, not anymore, traditionally, would have found attractive. And so, some indigenous groups would bind the heads of their infants, and so, they would look down the coast and say, oh, well, look at those round heads down there. Aren't they weird? And then the people down the coast who didn't do this would look and say, oh, look at those cone heads up there. Aren't they bizarre? And so there were different cultural ideas of beauty, right? And so this was one of them. Again, there's no risk to infants, and there's no problem with having a skull this shape. But for those of us with, sort of unmodified heads, it looks kind of strange, right? I think it looks a little strange. But again, for some indigenous people, not only in this part of the world, but in South America as well, this was a common practice of binding the heads of infants to sort of shape how the skull developed and how it grew. And so, yeah, some people would have these slightly longer cone-shaped skulls. Again, they don't do this anymore. You won't see this. You won't see this in modern days, but they did it in the past. Okay, let me just see where I am here. Okay. Oh, right. Okay, I have a little thing for you to read on myths and spirits and shamans, but I think we'll take a break first. Then when the break's over, we'll come back, we'll deal with this, and that will, I think, give us enough to start watching the film. But that's what we'll do when we get back. Okay, and we are back. So, as we saw before the break, I've got a um, short little reading for you here that talks about, um, well, some of the things that I think are kind of interesting about really any culture, not just Indigenous peoples, but a little reading that deals with myths and spirits and shamans. And so, the reading itself is in Microsoft Teams, so of course I'd like you to read it. There's some questions at the end of the article that I'd like you to answer. And so once we've read and answered those, we'll come back and talk about what we've read, okay? So I'll turn you loose to read that. You'll see it in Microsoft Teams. It's called Myths, Spirits, and Shamans, okay? Cool. Maybe just a couple more minutes, if that's okay? Couple minutes? Okay. 2 more minutes. Okay. Let's talk about a few of these questions, people. Although I think the answers are in part things that we already knew from other cultures, but let's see what we say here. So what's the purpose of myth in First Nations cultures? Right, so yeah, myths are stories, and so on the surface level they are hopefully entertaining stories that people enjoy, but what else? Right, so myths encode society's morals, right, and ethics, and what's good and bad, and right and wrong. And so, yeah, Indigenous people's stories are, in this way, no different, right? They teach us norms of behavior and what's good and bad and right and wrong. What else? Yeah, it helps to justify their pre-existing beliefs, right? Spiritual beliefs and beliefs about the way that the world works and the way that the universe works. Those things will be supported by myth. What else? Yeah, it explains the difference between ethnic groups, right? So those people on the other side of the valley, they have pointy heads, right? We have round heads. Why is that, right? And so myths may help to explain why people are different, why the people over there are different from the people that are here, right? What else? Might help to explain the origins of things as well, right? So why is the land the way it is, right? Why are there people here, right? How did people come to live in this land? How was this land created? Where does it come from, right? All of those things indigenous stories will tell us as well, right? And so, every culture is unique. Indigenous cultures are certainly unique, but again, they share similar features with other cultures that we've dealt with in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in India, in China, in Greece, in Rome. Here we have a group of people that again create stories and myths to transmit cultural meaning, right? In terms of good and bad, right and wrong, about how the universe works and how the world came to be. What is our purpose of being here? Where did we come from? What will happen when we die? Again, some of those things are religious concerns, but myth has a role to play as well. And so even though the stories that we might hear from indigenous cultures are different than the Greek myths or the Roman myths or the Egyptian myths, even though they're different, their function is the same, right? They transmit the same type of information to the culture, right? To the people of the culture. What are Transformers? Not the Michael Bay movies; those are dreadful. But what are Transformers? Sorry, Michael Bay. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. Make a better movie. Actually, the first one wasn't bad. What's that? No? Did you like them? There's a lot of CGI. I know, it was mine too, to be honest. That's why I like the first one. What's a transformer in myth? Right, so they're characters that show up in multiple myths. That's often true. What else do we know about them? They're what? Right? So they're often shapeshifters, right? So they can appear as different animals or different people. And what else do they do? Transformers usually have one other important characteristic. They are tricksters, right? And so, have we talked about tricksters before in this class? No? Yeah, so many cultures around the world will have trickster figures or trickster gods, okay? And so often they can transform, like it says here, and often they're characters who try to get other people in trouble, or they get themselves into trouble. Often they just cause chaos for their own amusement. The perfect example of this type of character from myth that probably most of us are familiar with is Loki. And so everyone's seen probably a Marvel movie here, familiar with Loki. Loki is a trickster figure in Norse mythology, and he remains that trickster figure in the Marvel universe as well. And so Loki has all of the characteristics of a trickster figure, right? Does he shapeshift? Yeah, he turns himself into all sorts of visual appearances. We've seen him do that. Does he try to trip people up and cause trouble for people? He does. Do we ever know whose side he's on? No, he always seems to lie and cheat, and he helps out and then he does something to screw over Thor, and you never really know what he's going to do, right? He's always playing tricks on people. He's thinking several steps ahead, trying to deceive or weasel his way out of a situation, and that's exactly what a trickster is. And so for indigenous people, Raven and Coyote are usually trickster figures, and so their role in myth is very similar to Loki. They will do things to kind of get an advantage or get their way or cause trouble for other people. Sometimes they'll get themselves into trouble, which is also something we see with Loki. He thinks he's outsmarted everyone only to wind up, imprisoned or something. And so the trickster figures from indigenous myth are very similar in that regard. They do the same kinds of things. What's animism? Hello? Is this thing on? Hello? Right. The idea that everything has a spirit. Things are animated, right? Not in terms of cartoons, but things are animated in that everything has a spirit, right? That tree over there is a spirit in that tree, right? Everything has a spirit. And so, and that's kind of an interesting worldview, right? To think of everything having a spirit. Because do you think that if you thought that everything had some sort of animated spirit within it, how would you treat those things? Would you treat them differently? Yeah? Yeah. It's easy not to be nice to something if you don't think that it has any kind of spirit, right? Is this just a travel mug? Yeah, it's just a travel mug. It doesn't matter what happens to it, right? I've dropped it. It's dented. Whoops, right? But if I actually believe that there's a spirit to this, then I might look at it differently, right? I might respect it a little more. I might treat it more carefully because it's a someone, right? There is something to this. It's not just an object. It's some kind of a spiritual being, right? And so that's kind of an interesting way to look at things. And again, it's very different from the Western point of view that, in the strictest Christian Western tradition, really only people have spirits, right? Only people have souls. Dogs, cats, no souls, right? Dogs and cats don't go to heaven in the strictest Christian sense, right? So this is a very different worldview that says that not only do dogs and cats have spirits, but almost everything has a spirit, right? The river, the trees, the mountain, the stone, all of these things have a spirit residing within them. And again, how does that change how you interact with your world if you believe that that is true? Right?
You'd be more grateful for that if you think that way. Like say for your cup, if you think that's like a spirit, you'd be more grateful, oh, you have a cup, you can,
Yeah, I always have this cup with me. It's always with me. It's, keeps my coffee warm. It's my, I kind of cradle it here all morning and, keep it with me. And yeah, I might kind of gain a different respect for the cup, right? A different kind of attachment, right? A different kind of, almost a relationship with the cup rather than it's just a thing, right? A thing that I own. And it's probably worth saying that I think that's a big, we'll come back to this a little bit later, not much later because we're almost done this course, but we'll come back to this in just a little while where we talk about, how does it change how you look at your world when you change your place in it, right? And so the traditional Western and Christian depiction of the world is that humans are in charge of the world, right? God created the earth and he created the sun, the heavens and the sun and the moon and all those things. He created all the animals and plants, and then he created humans, right? And goose. Another goose. Another one. Holy cow. It's a lot of geese. so he creates all these things, and then he gives man dominion over all the creatures, right? To use as he sees fit, right? And so think about that when, the difference between looking at all the animals and the earth as resources or something that you own and can do with what you want, rather than being in relationship with things, right? So, we're not, I don't own things, but I am in relationship with them, and I have to negotiate that relationship, right? That's a different way of existing and seeing the world, right? And it would probably change how you go through the world and the choices you make, right? Even with something as simple as the travel mug, but imagine with the salmon, right? Are the salmon a resource, or are the salmon, all of these spiritual beings that are going to give their lives so that we can continue to live, right? That's a different way of looking at things, right? And again, indigenous people would have seen the world much differently from the colonizers who came after, right? Last question I'll ask you today, I think, is this one. What's a shaman, and why are they important? You've probably heard this word before, yes? Yeah. What's a shaman? A what? A grand wizard. In a way. What do they say in the text here, or in the article? Yeah. And maybe a better way to think about them, or the way I've always thought about them, is that the shaman is someone who they almost have a foot in both worlds. Okay, so they're part of our human world, but they also have one foot in the spirit world, and they can move between these two realms of existence, right? And so again, when we talked about our 5 characteristics of religion, all religions have people who can interact with the supernatural. And so here, the shaman can interact with the supernatural. They can communicate with the spirit world. They can enter it. They can find out things that other people can't find out. They can bring things back from the spirit world. All of these things they can do. And so they can kind of move between two worlds. And so, like Mulder says, they can operate like spiritual doctors, right? If you lose your soul and it gets lost in the spirit world, the shaman can enter the spirit world and retrieve it for you, right? They can also get answers to questions. They can, ask certain supernatural beings to do things. They're someone who can move between two worlds. Right? Yeah. I think I'll leave it there. Does anyone have any questions at the moment? Animism, myths, shamans, spirit worlds, vision quests, trickster figures. No. Loki. Did anyone see the trailer for the new Loki series? Did you see it? Oh, it looks really good, actually. I'm not sure. What's that? He did, but he's back. He's back. Huh? It's not. I don't really know what it is. I think that based on what the trailer says, they've found a very clever way of working around the timeline. But I'll leave it there. But I think it looks good. Falcon and the Winter Soldier I haven't seen yet, or WandaVision. But what's that? Yeah. But Loki looks pretty entertaining, I think. Anyway, that's all for today. Have a nice afternoon, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.